Right time, the right league, the right analysts, the right show. Welcome to SEC Breakdown. This is your spot for SEC football, 24/7, 365 throughout the year, even in this dead time between the end of spring football and the beginning of August camp. Mike Loveall from Last Word on Sports, David Waters from right here on SEC Breakdown, myself, Mark Rogers. We may actually hear from Chad Neipling as well, jumping on board in just a few minutes. And our special guest this week, James Coe from the NFL Network.
I'm a big college football fan too, although I feel like I'm in enemy territory here because I'm a big Pac-12 guy. But that's okay. I want to represent the Pac a little bit in SEC territory now.
So you're getting a bit of a feel like I feel like half the time on this show because I kind of represent the rest of college football on this show, James, and these are the SEC guys.
Yeah.
So welcome to my world.
Love it.
And this going mostly to SEC fans watching this, James. We know what they think of SEC football. It's like sure. NFL, SEC. So basically having you on, you'll probably become a regular because we'll need to talk about the NFL and SEC on even ground.
Sure, I love it. It's funny that you mentioned that the NFL might be just a touch above the SEC. I think to most SEC fans, I tell you what, man, you're going to be hard-pressed to find an Alabama fan. I guarantee you there are a number of Alabama fans that think that Alabama this past year would have given like the Tennessee Titans a run for their money.
So that's usually one of those questions people will throw out when somebody completes a really dominant college football season. It's like, well, they could beat the Jacksonville Jaguars or the Tennessee Titans or the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, I don't know about all that, but that's okay.
Hopefully none of us are in that camp, or we'll have a debate at some point. But, yeah, James, you've come to the right place to talk SEC football as it relates to the NFL. So let's get it started just talking about what you're involved in right now, and then I'm going to let David and Mike cut loose on the SEC connection to the NFL. So what are you working on these days, James?
Well, as you mentioned, it's kind of a little bit of a dead period, but right now we rolled out a new Facebook page for NFL Fantasy. So for those of you who don't know, I work on the NFL Network. I'm one of the hosts for a very popular show there called NFL Fantasy Live. It's basically the official fantasy football show of the NFL. It does extremely well, both on the network and just in the sports cable universe. For a long time, NFL had just their own Facebook page. The fantasy side of it, as you guys probably know, has done very, very well. And so they decided to launch a fantasy-only Facebook page. So you could find that at facebook.com/NFLFantasy. Again, that's facebook.com/NFLFantasy. A lot of the stuff, a lot of the videos that we'll have, that we have currently, a lot of our breakdowns, analysis, think pieces, opinion pieces, those will all be found on that site as well. And it drives me nuts too, right? Because people say, well, it's the off season. What do you guys talk about in fantasy? I'm like, bro, fantasy and football are the exact same thing. This is like me going to an SEC fan and saying, well, it's the off season. Why do you guys care about what's happening with it? No, it never stops. It never stops. Regular football, fantasy football, all of this stuff is all interconnected, and it never stops. I have my own podcast, the NFL Fantasy Live podcast, that we do every Tuesday. We pump that out. We've got videos on NFL Now that we pump out, debate pieces as to who would you rather have, Adrian Peterson or David Johnson, who's going to have the bigger year, Ezekiel Elliott or Devontae Freeman. So listen, the content never stops, and it never stops being fun to talk about the content either.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. I guess the SEC's dominated the draft for as long as they can. But for you guys on the fantasy side, what do you look for in rookies that you can point to that they may have a successful season? Because I'm pretty sure that's difficult trying to translate, as it is for real NFL GMs, the translation from college to NFL. And two guys in particular for this year, Laquan Treadwell and Derrick Henry.
I mean, for me, a lot of it, I first start with metrics. I feel like I approach fantasy a way a lot of GMs will approach prospects in the NFL draft, in that, look, I like to look at measurables, right? And then I like to look at skills, and then I like to look at situation. There are a number of guys. Sammy Coates comes to mind. All right, big, strong, physical kid. Put together, pretty solid seasons there at Auburn, and you're thinking, okay, well, this guy's a decent prospect. Look, I get it. His measurables through the roof, unbelievable athlete. For my money, though, I just wasn't convinced he was going to be a good NFL player, and I'm still not, because he can't catch the ball. Color me crazy here, but I like my wide receivers to be able to catch the ball with some regularity. So the skill set to me didn't marry with the physical tools. So those are two things I look at first and foremost, and those are probably 1A and 1B. Then I like to look at situation. You mentioned Laquan Treadwell. He could not have gone to a better situation in my mind. Right now they got a guy in Stephon Diggs, played at Maryland. Pretty good ball player, but to me does not read as your typical go-to wide receiver. Very good wide receiver. If you watch the show, I like me some Stephon Diggs. But that being said, Laquan Treadwell, not the greatest speed in the world, but if they can get down into that red zone area, he's just a tremendous target. And we saw that, at his time at Ole Miss as well. So he's been a good red zone receiver. He's got great hands, big, tall kid. Again, not the greatest speed in the world. I don't necessarily know if that's going to totally hinder him when it comes to playing for the Minnesota Vikings, because, again, he's got to see single coverage. Adrian Peterson's in the backfield, man. Like, safeties are going to be creeping up to that line because it's a run-heavy attack anyways. But Laquan Treadwell pairing up with someone like Teddy Bridgewater, I like it. I don't mind the fit at all, and the overall skill set I like. I like him going in to 2016. Now, how high will I take him? Listen, in fantasy, he's not more than a double-digit guy. So you're looking at him, 11th, 12th round, and that's only because there's so many more well-established guys at that position. But in terms of upside, certainly he's got it.
And Derrick Henry, if you can hit on Derrick Henry.
Yeah, Derrick Henry, man, again, the measurables, great. Big, strong, physical kid, great speed, unbelievable speed given his size, really. I had the opportunity to kind of see him do a tour of, he did some on-air stuff for the network, and I got to see him in person. I mean, he is a monster. That dude is an absolute behemoth. It's unbelievable how big he is. And then I look at that 40 time, and I'm like, how is this possible? I'm like, if this dude is part of the human race, I must not be, because I don't see how we're the same. I don't get it. But no, he's an absolute physical specimen. The skill set, there's a big debate about the skill set, I think, in the fantasy community and in real life as well. It's almost like, is he too big and is he not elusive enough? And I think that's going to be a big question mark. Brandon Jacobs had 2, maybe 3 very, very good years. But he broke down. And it's because guys like Ray Lewis, other supreme linebackers, were chopping at that dude's legs. You're not going to be able to take a guy like Derrick Henry down from the shoulder pad. That's obvious. So can he protect himself from an injury standpoint when linebackers who are coming full bore are going for his legs? Can he protect himself enough to do that? I'm not sold. I'm one of the guys that's not necessarily sold on Derrick Henry. So, from a fantasy perspective, I'm not buying. That being said, he's also not in a great situation because DeMarco Murray is there theoretically in front of him. I don't necessarily love DeMarco Murray either, but that's okay. I just think that from a fantasy perspective, DeMarco Murray poses a giant roadblock to success, at least early on, for Derrick Henry. And you know what, man? I honestly think that's a blessing in disguise for him, to be able to catch up to that speed, to figure out the NFL level of play, and again, be able to watch some film, study some defenders, and pick up habits that maybe some of these guys will do. And I do believe he'll get coaching as to how to protect himself a little bit more. So him being delayed from being a starter, I think, is going to help him. I really honestly believe he's the kind of guy that needs to kind of get used to that NFL speed, so it doesn't catch him by surprise, and potentially set him back from an injury standpoint. So he's a guy that's interesting, man. Like, I really believe in him maybe from week 10 and on, but I would say the first half of the season, I'm not buying. And I have him just outside of my top 100. But so again, if you're looking in that 11th or 12th round range, I'd probably buy on him there, but I think he'll be off the board before then.
James, Mike here. Thanks for joining us. I got two questions for you. The first of which is one of the differences between college ball and the NFL is the wide range of systems and schemes that offenses run in college ball. Everything from Paul Johnson's triple option at Georgia Tech to the air raid up at Washington State. From a talent evaluation perspective or a fantasy points production analyst perspective, how much does a offensive system or an offensive scheme weigh on a player as he transitions from college ball to the NFL? And if you think that matters at all, how long is the adoption time for the player to transition from a specific or a unique scheme, be it an air raid or a triple option, to a more pro-style system?
Complicated question, as you know. Great question. I love it. Here's the thing, man, for me. We saw guys like Calvin Johnson, considered one of, and is one of, the greatest wide receivers of all time. But you talk about him coming out of a very low volume passing attack there at Georgia Tech. Man, it really depends. For me, like I said, when I evaluate talent from a fantasy perspective, and again, I'm really just looking for stats, right? I'm not necessarily looking for, okay, is this guy going to be a good run blocker? Is this guy going to be able to do this? Is he a good locker room guy? Like, I'm not evaluating the talent from that perspective. It's just, hey, man, is this guy going to score touchdowns? Hey, man, is this guy going to catch balls for yardage? So when we start talking about systems, I'll tell you what I like. I like wide receivers who come from wide open systems because they're used to the volume. And for me, the volume, all that means is reps. That's all that means to me. It just means how often are they in live game situations against live defenders trying to knock their heads off, pressing them, how many different situations are they seeing. So for me, a wide receiver like Corey Coleman, who comes from a wide open Baylor system, I really dig that, because what that means to me is that he's seen different coverage. He's seen different types of corners. And again, he's used to being the man. Here's the thing, and I know a lot of SEC fans will, relate to this. It's hard being the man and then trying to figure out how to be a complementary player. Also, the same goes the other way. A lot of these guys that we see from high school, right, they go and they are the guy in high school. But when they get to a program like Ole Miss, Alabama, Tennessee, these premium Georgia, premium programs, right, they got to see where they fit in. A lot of these guys don't make that transition very well, right? So for me, so that's what I'm trying to say. So it's like if a guy who is the guy in college now is being asked to be a secondary player in the NFL, how is that transition going to happen? I think it's pretty tough. I really do. And vice versa. If somebody was a secondary player for their prospective college team and now is being asked to shoulder the load at the NFL level, I think that's a pretty tough transition as well. So when we start talking about system, I think there is a transitional period, and there's no question you'd be a fool not to take that into consideration, especially from a fantasy perspective. But sometimes, like in the case of Calvin Johnson, talent trumps all. Talent, skill, work ethic. I think really honestly, those are the things that I look at. I want to read up. I jokingly talk about not caring about whether a guy's a good locker room guy. But I tell you what, man, being paid to analyze these players from a fantasy perspective, I'll tell you what, man, I want to know if they got a good work ethic. I want to know if they've got a good head on their shoulders. And it was like I was saying about Johnny Manziel. I'm like, look, not only from a physical size, speed combination, is he a bad fit as an NFL quarterback? The guy's partying way too much, as is from a college perspective. What's it going to be like when they start handing this dude $1 million checks? And that's why I wasn't big on Johnny Manziel, especially from a fantasy perspective, and from a real life perspective as well. So yeah, I try to do some character study, and it's hard because some of the local papers tend to do a little bit more softer of a job, maybe figuring out what somebody's work ethic or character might be. But make no mistake, the high character guys you hear about and you know about, and those are the guys that I start to get a little bit more interested in. If they've got that great size and speed combination, if they've got the skill set and they're going into the right situation.
James, great segue with Johnny Manziel. I want to ask you one more question, not fantasy football related.
Yeah.
Why do you think the SEC struggles to get top talent at the quarterback position?
Again, we start talking about reps, right? So wide open system, and same thing for quarterbacks, right? So it's like I know there's been a lot of, quarterbacks don't make reads. They don't have to call audibles at the college level. All they got to do is look to the sideline. I don't necessarily know if that's totally true, right? Yeah, okay, fine. They're going to get the play call from the sideline. That's fine. But they still got to see what's going on out there. They still got to go through at least preliminary reads. And for me, I think reps are a big thing. I don't care what profession you're in. You could be in television. You could be in writing. You could be podcasting. You could be in radio. You could be a pro athlete. You need the reps. And for me, too many of these SEC teams have not adopted a quarterback-reliant offense. Too often we're seeing SEC teams kind of fall back on that old-school smash-mouth, Paul Bryant, forget it, let's just set 11 guys at the line and run this ball. The game's moved on, right? And so the reason you're not seeing a lot of SEC quarterbacks translate well to the NFL, in my opinion, is the fact that when they're in the SEC and they're asked to do so little, when they're asked to throw the ball 11, 12 times a game, that's not developing their skills. I don't care how many times they might be doing that in practice. You got to get live game simulation. You got to get hit by linebackers, man. You got to feel that safety coming in off that line to develop some of that, pocket instinct. And I think pocket instinct is a big time. How do you measure? There's no way to measure that. But we've seen some of the all-time greats. Tom Brady's not a mobile dude, man. But I tell you what, his presence in the pocket, you can't even compare it. He makes little small moves, shifty moves inside the pocket to elude defenders. And to me, I don't necessarily know if SEC quarterbacks would get those kind of reps through the low volume attacks that most SEC teams do favor nowadays.
And as you well know, James, if the objective was preparing players for the NFL and specifically quarterbacks, then the SEC would be not failing miserably, but would not be hitting the mark. But the objective is to win games at the collegiate level, and the SEC is certainly doing a much better job than the other four major conferences. James Coe from the NFL Network, most specifically the host of NFL Fantasy Live. So my question for you, James, has to do with baseball is the ultimate numbers game. The NFL has surpassed baseball by far in terms of fantasy because of sheer popularity. College football is extremely popular. Could be easily argued the second most popular sport in America to the NFL.
Oh, yeah.
Why do you think, or do you think that college football could adopt some sort of fantasy? Maybe there's some underground fantasy leagues out there, but really no viable college football fantasy leagues out there. Would love to see it. We may start it here on SEC Breakdown, James.
Man, it's too hard. I mean, here's the thing, man. Honestly, well, first of all, let me say this: there are fantasy leagues that you can play, both for money and for free, that involve the college game in terms of a fantasy standpoint. But I mean, come on. We just talked about it. We talked about different systems. Like, it's hard to compare. You know, you talk about the air raid system at Washington State or the bear raid system, which I'm not a fan of because I went to Cal, and I don't particularly enjoy watching that brand of football, but that's okay. The stats they put up are absurd, right? It's absurd. It's not. And for me, I think fantasy, part of the popularity of fantasy is that it puts a numerical value to, there's a numerical value that's tied to real life value as well. So when we say Antonio Bryant, wow, I'm going way back. When I say Antonio Brown is the #1 wide receiver in fantasy, well, there's an approximation there that you're saying, well, he's one of the best wide receivers in the actual game of NFL football as well. When I say Odell Beckham Jr. is a better fantasy wide receiver than Dez Bryant, I'm approximating a little bit here that Odell Beckham Jr. is more valuable in real life as well compared to Dez Bryant. Now, you might not necessarily agree with that, but there's certainly strong arguments to be made there. So I think the popularity of NFL, like fantasy in the NFL game, it's like we're all playing little mini GMs. And what we're able to do is basically say, well, we're able to find gems, we're able to find studs, and we're able to avoid guys who we think are going to have down years, or who maybe we think are overvalued or overrated or whatever it might be. That doesn't necessarily translate, right, to college? Because, again, I don't think anybody's trying to say Kenny Lawler from Cal is a better wide receiver than Laquan Treadwell. I don't think that makes any sense whatsoever. And that's why, and so now when we start looking at the fantasy game from the college perspective, that whole tie-in of the numbers to reality just goes straight out the window. And I think that kind of loses some of its appeal. Plus, it's the name brand, too. It's like, you're not going to find many SEC guys who even know who Kenny Lawler is. You're not going to find many Pac-12 guys, right, who know who the second-string wide receiver is for Alabama. You know what I mean? So there's some name recognition lost in the college game as well.
Totally agree. Although it would bring another point of strategy into the mix when you'd have to measure the levels of football and probably go out to the Mountain West to grab your wide receivers, because even though they're not as good as Mike Evans and Odell Beckham Jr. and Jarvis Landry, they're going to put up better numbers.
That's right.
All right.
So, and again, that whole unknown thing, though, man, like, I'm a big proponent of drafting your guy in fantasy. And what I mean by that is, if you're a fan, go get that guy. I'm not saying pay a crazy price, but, you know, if you want to pay a round or two early to go get your guy, go get your guy. And I think that's what makes fantasy fun, is that when you watch it on Sundays, you're like, yep, I drafted that guy. Yep, I believe in him. And yep, he's performing. And I think the living and dying by that of these individual players, I've seen it firsthand, man. It's like the living and dying of your own fantasy team has really brought along the NFL game.
Hey, James, we appreciate the time, man, jumping on board. We connected on Twitter a couple months ago, and we appreciate you, as we extended the invitation, you jumping on with us.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Anytime you guys need me, I'll be here. It's always great to talk with good, hardcore college football fans.
We definitely are. You have found the right place here. And since we are talking about a left tackle and Laremy Tunsil next, we know that he's completely irrelevant to you, James.
Fair enough.
So you can get back to the family, and we're going to talk about the guys in the trenches that don't compile any statistics at all.
There you go.
It's really boring
stuff.
stuff.
Appreciate the time.
James Coe from the NFL Network. Appreciate it, James. All right, Chad's joined us here. This is good to see. Mr. Chad Neipling. How's it going tonight, Chad?
No, it's good, guys. Trying to catch up with everything that's going on, catching up with the action around the conference. Getting some airtime here lately, trying to pump up the brand of SEC Breakdown, trying to make this thing a little bit more known, and I think we're doing a good job, guys. You guys are doing a great job, and people are recognizing that.
Chad, you've been carrying the banner for the SEC
Breakdown.
Yes, you have. Well, we got a situation here, guys. Laremy Tunsil, obviously the talk of the NFL draft, especially when it comes to the SEC connection. And then the comments made after the NFL draft when the questions were asked and the comments were made that not necessarily should have been made, that really opened up Pandora's box possibly here. And then we see out of Sports Illustrated this week allegations aimed at Ole Miss, as I'm reading from the CBS article, providing impermissible benefits to football players, most notably Laremy Tunsil not going away. Extensive look into the Ole Miss situation published Wednesday by SI. Tunsil's stepfather, Lindsey Miller, went on record detailing how the Rebels allegedly provided a variety of benefits to Tunsil and his family. He summarized Ole Miss's process as like the Blue Chips movie, referring to the 1994 movie. Among the things that Miller says he told the NCAA, Ole Miss had an intricate system in which the school arranged for Tunsil and his family through boosters to get loans, money, free lodging at hotels and residences around Oxford. He claims he told the NCAA of benefits that spanned nearly 3 years, which would have, of course, been the entire stay of Laremy Tunsil at Ole Miss. So, Mike, we'll start with you and what you make of and the details that are even much more elaborate than what I just read.
Well, Mark, I'm not really sure what to believe from Larry Tunsil's stepfather, Mr. Miller. I don't know. We're only hearing one side of the story, and he's only telling us, and we know there's bad blood in the family. We know there's been issues there. He's only telling us what he wants us to know that he may have told the NCAA. We don't even know for fact that that's actually what he told the NCAA. We also don't hear Ole Miss's side of the story. So right now, from a PR perspective, it's a one-sided story from the Miller camp. The NCAA is notoriously long on these investigations. This will drag out a year or two. The players involved will have long been gone, I think, by the time the NCAA gets around to this. So I do think Ole Miss fans probably need to be a little bit worried. The NCAA is going to dig into the Ole Miss program, but I really have a hard time believing the Miller story. Additionally, the other thing is, for Miller to make these accusations that it's a complex system that the school is providing the boosters, he has to show them, or at least give them the evidence, or give them the lead of how the boosters are connected to the school. Certainly, if the boosters are doing things wrong, Ole Miss can be held accountable for the program. But if there's no clear linkage between the school and the boosters, that limits what the NCAA can do to the school. So I have a really hard time really believing the Miller story, and until I see facts that support that. Ole Miss fans should be a little bit worried, but I don't think it's as serious for Ole Miss yet as it could be. It could get serious, but remember, we're only hearing the Miller side of the story, and I think we should approach that with a little bit of healthy skepticism.
Yeah, guys, I'm going to kind of take a different direction in this because our good friend Evie is been really close friend of mine as well, and so is her husband David. And I've had a chance to kind of chat with her a little bit about some things, and I do think it's maybe a little bit more severe than intentionally being understood. And the reason why I say that is because I think this is going to come down to what the NCAA during their investigation deems proof, being that it's not a legal entity. It can, and we've seen this in the past, you guys have seen this in the past, where severity of punishments have varied greatly beyond, it may be some of the same actual the same broken rules, but punishments have varied in the past. We've seen that with the NCAA. So what I'm looking at and what I'm thinking is that what they deem to be proof, what they deem to set up the storyline as to what has happened. I feel like that's kind of the direction we're going here because of the fact that Miller spoke to them for 100+ hours. You don't speak to somebody for 100+ hours and show them text, Facebook messages, Twitter, things of that nature, all this proof that he supposedly has. You don't spend that amount of time with somebody if there's not something there. I think they're trying to create maybe a line of, is this a cultural issue because there are so many infractions at this point? And the other thing is to keep in mind, in 2017, they were supposed to have a board meeting, and at that point, we're going to talk about some of the punishments that would be deemed or doled out to Ole Miss at that time. If before then, during this investigation, they have to actually stop to go and investigate a player and his comments that were made during the draft. That tells me that there's something here, guys. And how much of a smoking gun, we'll have to wait and see. But I do feel like, when the punishment comes, it could be pretty severe for Ole Miss, considering the amount of allegations that we're seeing that are not just football-oriented, but they're in other sports as well. And that looks more like institutional or cultural issues. And maybe that's the picture the NCAA is trying to paint here with these allegations that they've come up with.
Is there any more beside Miller's evidence that they have that we don't know of, or does the NCAA even need more? Is what they have enough to go forward? And I think a lot of this, what we read in the articles, is a lot of information we kind of already knew, but just maybe a little bit more detail. And it's kind of hard. Maybe the question looms is, can Miller be trusted due that he and Tunsil have been at odds for a good while now? He seems to have some evidence that he can give. I guess we probably really don't know if that's going to be enough for the NCAA. And I think for Ole Miss is if they do find out something from the NCAA, when does that come out? Is it anytime soon? Does it hang over their head for the whole season? Do they find out if they're on the SEC championship run that, here comes the big punishment? Does that set up for a bowl ban, or they got this great season going and then all this falls? So I think there's a lot of questions that are, Ole Miss fans have to ask themselves, how harsh is the punishment and when does it come out? That it could be pretty devastating for maybe a successful season that Ole Miss has.
And David, to your point, hanging over the program, you got to wonder about how it's going to affect the recruits, because in the SEC, the difference between the schools is razor thin. So if you're a 5-star, 4-star recruit and you're looking at what school you want to go to, you've got it narrowed down to 3 or 4, and one of those schools has that cloud of probation hanging over its head, that absolutely might make the difference on what school you choose to go to.
Right, you've joined SEC Breakdown. We come your way with football talk each and every Wednesday night and release record both the audio and the video on Thursday morning. You can catch it on YouTube and also on Podbean, SEC Breakdown. Please join us on Twitter as well. And we talk nothing but SEC football 24/7, 365. We will have top 5 lists at every position as we go throughout the summer. We've knocked out the safeties. We're going to move on to the cornerbacks next. Definitely join us on Twitter, because you're going to see polls out there speaking to what's going on with the SEC. Breaking news. We'll have polls out that will deal with your opinion concerning what's going on in the SEC. And most notably this week, we had a question come from a viewer who wanted to know our opinion on some of the better coaching talent in the SEC, Dave.
Yeah, Chris in Georgia, and I think Chad Neipling said he knows we've got Chris in Georgia a pretty good bit Twitter interaction there. Big Tennessee fan, I'm guessing, from Georgia. So his question was, best new position coach hire in the SEC?
I think if you're looking at as far as like a position coach, there's a couple that 2 guys that I really think were really, really good hires this year. One was Damian Craig for LSU. I think that was huge in the fact that that's going to pay dividends with Cam Cameron now allowing him to come into the field room to work with Harris and work with him on the field as well as working with the wide receivers. I think that could pay huge dividends for Brandon Harris. And if that happens, look for LSU to have more to their attack than just Fournette. And I think that could be the key to get LSU over the hump. The other guy I'm looking at is Pittman out of Georgia. I think that was a huge hire for them. A guy that we know in Arkansas as well as Tennessee knows that he is a guy that can really coach up some offensive line talent. I mean, he goes out, he's a monster on the recruiting trail. Not only that, he's a player's coach, and so guys really relate to him. I've had the privilege of interviewing him a couple times, and he is just a really cool cat. That's about the only way I could explain it. And so I really enjoyed talking with him, and I think that's the reason why players works so well with him. So those would be two of the guys that I'm thinking were probably the better position coaches that were hired here in the offseason.
So basically, anybody that Chad meets and would like to go out and have a beverage with is one of the top coaches in the SEC. That's like one of the criteria.
It is. I have to have a Coors banquet, and then we sit down and we have a conversation, and that's just how things start, man. That's how you get these relationships built, and
Right, Dave. Any other thoughts on the best assistants around the league? We know it's the highest paid coaching contingent in college football by far. The coordinators get paid like head coaches do elsewhere, and it trickles down to the assistants across the board.
Right. We mentioned Sam Pittman, so he was one of mine. I think I was going to go with at the expense of probably sounding biased a little bit. I'll go with Torian Gray for defensive back coach for Florida. Even with Hargraves and Neal out, Florida returns a whole slew of, secondary. Florida hasn't hurt for secondary guys for years now. It's just been that way. But they even got a boost when, Gray came from Virginia Tech. During his time there, he coached 5 All-Americans and 10 NFL draft picks. Cam Chancellor was there. Kyle Kendall Fuller, Brandon Flowers, in his first season as defensive back coach there at Virginia Tech, ranked first in pass defense and only allowed 5 passing touchdowns, the fewest in the nation. In his 10 seasons there, they ranked in the top 15 in pass defense 6 times, top 10 in completion percentage allowed 8 times, top 15 in opponent passer rating 8 times. I mean, he knows how to coach DBs, and now he has, it's hard to say that he'll have a lot more talent at Florida, but he will, and because Florida has proven that they know how to churn out DBs for years now. So pairing Gray with the talent he can get at Florida, to me, this makes that one of the, if not best hires in the SEC at a position.
Mark, I follow Chris in Georgia too, so I appreciate the question. I agree with Chad and David. Sam Pittman and Torian Gray are probably the 2 best position hires in the SEC this all season. I also had DeMoney and Craig in my top 5. I'll hit that in a minute. The reason I think Torian Gray is so great is he's come from that Bud Foster defense, so he knows how to coach defense. I think Bud Foster is probably the best defensive coordinator in college football. Sam Pittman, look for how well he works with Jim Chaney. If you look at the Pittman style of coaching the offensive line, it fits very nicely with Jim Chaney's systems and schemes. So that's why I think that's such a good hire. Here I got 2 more for you to look out for. Herb Hand, offensive line at Auburn. He leaves Penn State just like Bob Shoop, the new defensive coordinator of Tennessee, left James Franklin's staff, reunites with Gus Malzahn. Rhett Lashley's under a lot of pressure, the offensive coordinator at Auburn. If Malzahn lets Lashley go due to pressure, which I don't think he will, but if he does, Herb Hand might be a natural selection to take over offensive coordinator for that offense. If Malzahn stays and gets rid of Lashley. He's reunited with Malzahn. I think that's probably the top 3. I think DeMoney and Craig was probably the 4th best. Chad, one reason why DeMoney and Craig is one of the top 5, he's got to replace Frank Wilson at LSU, who went to be the head coach at UTSA. Craig will step in and fill that recruiting void and that void in the locker room as an assistant coach. The 5th one I'll tell you to look out for is Larry Scott, tight ends coach at Tennessee. Left Miami. He was the interim head coach. He'll be able to recruit South Florida. He's a big recruiter in South Florida. We've talked before. Butch Jones has done a good job of geographically recruiting different places, Midwest, Texas, the D.C., Northern Virginia area. One area Tennessee has not recruited well in the last 5 years since the Fulmer era is Florida, probably because they've lost to Florida for 11 straight years. So Larry Scott has that South Florida recruiting pedigree. That's going to help Tennessee both as a recruiter and a position coach. He was also the interim head coach, so he knows how to run a program. Another example of Butch Jones putting together a really good coaching staff there. Those are the 5 best hires, I would tell you. Probably Gray and Pittman vying for the best hire between those 2.
Mike, Larry Scott was Chris and George's pick, so we'll go with that.
No, Chris and George on Twitter, you know why he was his pick.
And if there's not an endorsement right there as to why people should send in their questions and their comments and let you guys go at it, I don't know what is. So I just heard, like Chad said over here, dropping knowledge bombs all over the place. That's what we do here on SEC Breakdown every Wednesday night. So join us on Twitter and check out the videos and the audio podcasts as well. This is edition number 22, and it only gets better as we break down the SEC with only about 10 weeks to LSU, Wisconsin, Alabama, USC, Ole Miss, Florida State, and so on. Can't wait. So for Chad Neipling, for David Waters, for Mike Loveall, I'm Mark Rogers. This is SEC Breakdown. We will see you next time.